Hi, and welcome to my channel. Here, you'll discover some of the most incredible events in history. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss anything, leave a like in advance, and enjoy the story. At the end of the Second World War in 1945, the balance of global power was transformed. The world became divided between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. This was not to be a conventional conflict where armies directly faced one another, but rather an ideological confrontation, a struggle between capitalism and communism, between East and West. Each side aimed to expand its influence, winning over nations and shaping global politics in its own image. One of the defining elements of this rivalry was the nuclear arms race. Both the United States and the Soviet Union built vast arsenals of atomic and later thermonuclear weapons. Central questions of the time revolved around how to control such destructive power, whether these weapons could be limited, and whether humanity could survive their potential use. From the era of Stalin to that of Reagan, from the Korean and Vietnam Wars to the Berlin Wall and the Cuban Missile Crisis, nuclear policy and military strategy lay at the heart of the confrontation. Europe, devastated by years of war, was quickly divided into two spheres. The Soviet Union, having lost almost 27 million people during the conflict, sought security by creating a buffer zone in Eastern Europe. Stalin installed communist regimes in countries such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria, ensuring that Moscow's influence dominated the region. The British statesman Winston Churchill would famously declare in 1946 that an iron curtain had descended across the continent, separating East from West. For the United States, the war had resulted in economic strength and unrivaled military supremacy. The American economy was thriving, while Europe's economies lay in ruins. The United States alone possessed the atomic bomb, having demonstrated its power by dropping two on Japan in 1945. This combination of prosperity and military dominance secured America's role as a global leader determined to resist the spread of communism. The first serious confrontations emerged soon after the war. Stalin delayed the withdrawal of Soviet forces from Iran and pressured Turkey to grant him control over the Turkish Straits, a vital maritime passage. In response, President Truman announced the Truman Doctrine in 1947. This policy declared that the United States would provide political, military, and economic assistance to nations threatened by communism. Greece and Turkey became the first recipients of American aid, marking the beginning of the strategy known as containment. Containment was designed to prevent the spread of communism, rather than attempt to roll it back where it already existed. It became the cornerstone of American foreign policy throughout the Cold War. To further support this strategy, the United States launched the Marshall Plan in 1948, providing nearly $13 billion to rebuild the shattered economies of Western Europe. The idea was that prosperity would make communism less attractive. The Marshall Plan also encouraged closer integration of Western European economies and the promotion of free markets. Germany soon became the most visible symbol of the divided world. After its defeat in 1945, the country had been split into four zones of occupation. The East was controlled by the Soviet Union, while the West, Britain and later France, governed the West. Berlin, although located deep within the Soviet zone, was also divided in the same way. In 1948, Stalin attempted to force the Western powers out of the city by imposing the Berlin blockade, cutting off all road, rail, and canal access. President Truman responded with the Berlin Airlift, a massive operation in which American and British planes supplied West Berlin with food, fuel, and essential goods for over a year. The blockade eventually failed, and Stalin was forced to lift it in 1949. Soon after, the Western Allies established the Federal Republic of Germany in the West, while the Soviets proclaimed the German Democratic Republic in the East. As tensions grew, the United States and its allies created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949. This defensive alliance brought together the United States, Canada, and most of Western Europe, pledging that an attack on one would be considered an attack on all. In response, the Soviet Union continued to strengthen its control over Eastern Europe, setting the stage for decades of confrontation.
In order to confront the spread of communism more effectively, the United States also created a new intelligence organization. In 1947, the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, was established. Over the next few years, it grew rapidly in size and power. Between 1949 and 1952, the number of personnel multiplied more than 10 times, while its overseas bases expanded from 7 to nearly 50. The annual budget increased from just under $5 million to more than $80 million. The CIA soon began interfering in the politics of developing nations, especially where independence movements were perceived as leaning toward communism. In 1953, the agency helped overthrow the government of Iran, and in 1954, it orchestrated a coup in Guatemala. In both cases, unpopular regimes were installed, damaging America's image but strengthening its position in the Cold War struggle. Events in Asia quickly turned the conflict into a truly global contest. In 1949, Mao Zedong's communist revolutionaries declared victory in China, creating the People's Republic of China. The loss of the world's most populous nation to communism shocked Washington. In response, the United States increased support for Japan, transforming it into a strong economic ally in the region. At the same time, American aid flowed to French colonial forces in Indochina, who were fighting against the communist-led movement of Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. The first major military clash of the Cold War erupted in Korea. In 1950, Communist North Korea, supported by the Soviet Union and later by China, invaded South Korea. In Washington, the prevailing idea was the domino theory. If one country fell to communism, others would follow. Determined to prevent this, President Truman sent American forces under the United Nations flag. Tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers fought alongside South Korean and Allied troops, pushing the invaders back toward the north. The war dragged on for 3 bloody years, ending in an armistice in 1953. The border between the two Koreas remained almost exactly where it had been before the war, near the 38th parallel. More than 2 million people had lost their lives, but the conflict demonstrated that communism could be contained by force. After the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev rose to power in the Soviet Union. To balance the strength of NATO, he created the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance of Eastern Bloc nations. Khrushchev quickly proved himself an unpredictable and often provocative leader. In 1956, he threatened Britain and France with missile attacks during the Suez Crisis. His passionate outbursts became legendary, such as the time he allegedly banged his shoe on the table at the United Nations General Assembly in 1960. When John F. Kennedy entered the White House in 1961, tensions over Berlin escalated. Since the late 1940s, almost 3 million East Germans had fled to the West, most of them skilled and educated professionals escaping through West Berlin. To halt this drain, Khrushchev demanded that the Western powers withdraw from the city. Kennedy refused. In desperation, the Soviets and East Germans began constructing a physical barrier on August 12, 1961. What started as barbed wire soon became the Berlin Wall, a massive concrete structure 12 feet high and nearly 100 miles long, lined with guard towers, minefields, and soldiers. The wall became the most notorious symbol of the Cold War, a physical manifestation of the division between East and West. But Berlin was not the only flashpoint. Only a year later, the world came closer to nuclear war than ever before. In 1959, communist revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro had taken power in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. coast. Castro rejected American dominance and turned to Moscow for support. In 1961, Kennedy attempted to remove him with the Bay of Pigs invasion, using CIA-trained Cuban exiles. The operation ended in a disaster after just 3 days, humiliating the United States and convincing Khrushchev to protect Castro. In 1962, Soviet nuclear missiles were secretly shipped to Cuba. When American reconnaissance planes discovered the missile sites, Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of the island to prevent further deliveries. Nearly 150,000 American troops gathered in Florida, while the U.S. nuclear alert level was raised to DEFCON 2, the highest in history short of war. For days, the world stood on the brink of annihilation. At one point, a Soviet submarine, harassed by U.S. naval forces, prepared to fire nuclear torpedoes, believing that war had already begun. The launch required the consent of 3 officers on board. 2 agreed, but one, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. His decision prevented an immediate escalation into nuclear conflict. On October 28, 1962, after intense negotiations, Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for Kennedy's promise not to invade Cuba. Secretly, the U.S. also agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved, but it left a lasting scar. The 2 superpowers established a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow to reduce the risk of such a catastrophe ever happening again.
The next great test of the Cold War unfolded in Southeast Asia. In Vietnam, the United States had been supporting the government of the South in its struggle against the Communist North for nearly a decade. After the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, inherited the problem. Convinced that allowing South Vietnam to collapse would make America look weak in the eyes of the world, Johnson escalated U.S. involvement dramatically. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers were sent to fight, and the conflict soon grew into one of the most divisive wars in American history. Despite superior firepower, the U.S. faced an enemy skilled in guerrilla tactics and supported by both the Soviet Union and China. The Viet Cong, allied with North Vietnam, waged a war of attrition, striking unexpectedly and disappearing into dense jungles or hidden tunnel networks. The conflict dragged on, producing shocking images of devastation and heavy casualties. By 1968, public opinion in the United States had turned sharply against the war. That year, massive protests erupted, with students and activists filling the streets, arguing that the war was immoral and unwinnable. The scale of dissent overwhelmed President Johnson, who announced he would not seek re-election. Yet the war did not end. It continued for years under his successor, Richard Nixon. Finally, in 1973, the United States began a withdrawal, leaving the South to fight alone. 2 years later, Communist forces captured Saigon, unifying Vietnam under their rule. The toll was staggering. Over 58,000 Americans killed, alongside hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese soldiers, more than 1 million North Vietnamese fighters, and millions of civilians across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Unlike Korea, where communism had been contained, Vietnam proved that the doctrine of containment could fail. By the mid-1960s, the Soviet Union was also entering a period of crisis. Nikita Khrushchev had been removed from power in 1964, replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. His rule was marked by stagnation, corruption, and the tightening grip of authoritarian control. Living standards declined, while discontent simmered beneath the surface. To suppress uprisings, Brezhnev proclaimed what became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, declaring that the Soviet Union had the right to intervene militarily in any socialist country where communism was threatened. But Brezhnev also recognized the dangers of constant confrontation with the United States. By the late 1960s, Washington, too, was eager for a reduction in tensions. The protests over Vietnam had shaken America's confidence, and President Nixon was seeking new strategies. Thus began a period known as détente, a French word meaning relaxation or easing of tensions. In 1969, Nixon and Brezhnev opened talks on limiting nuclear arms. The result was the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT, which froze the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles on both sides. Détente produced a decade of relative stability. Although rivalries and proxy conflicts continued, both powers sought to avoid direct confrontation and to control the nuclear arms race. For the first time since 1945, there was a genuine hope that the two superpowers might coexist peacefully. But détente was fragile. By the late 1970s, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the deployment of new Soviet missiles in Eastern Europe reignited hostilities. In 1981, a new figure entered the scene, one who would challenge the entire course of the Cold War. Ronald Reagan became President of the United States and immediately rejected the idea that détente had brought lasting peace. To him, the Soviet Union was, as he declared, an evil empire. He argued that democracy and freedom would ultimately consign Marxism-Leninism to the ash heap of history. Yet Reagan's goal was not endless confrontation. He dreamed of a world free from nuclear weapons, but he believed the only path to this goal was through overwhelming strength. He launched a new arms buildup, determined to pressure Moscow into an arms reduction agreement it could not refuse. Central to this policy was the Strategic Defense Initiative, a plan to develop advanced missile defense systems using space-based technology. Critics mocked it as science fiction, calling it Star Wars, but the Soviets took it seriously. Knowing they lagged far behind in computer and space technology, the Kremlin realized it could not match the program without crippling its already weakened economy. The Soviet Union, facing mounting internal crises, was soon forced back to the negotiating table. In 1985, Reagan met a new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, a man who would prove to be one of the most significant figures of the entire Cold War. When Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in 1985, the Soviet Union was facing years of economic stagnation and rising unrest across Eastern Europe. Gorbachev understood that the country could not continue on its current path. He introduced a series of reforms that would change the Soviet Union forever. Perestroika, or restructuring, was aimed at modernizing the economy, while glasnost, or openness, encouraged transparency, free discussion, and criticism of corruption. For the first time in decades, the Soviet people could openly debate their government's policies. Gorbachev also recognized that the arms race with the United States was draining the Soviet economy beyond repair. Determined to shift course, he began a series of high-level meetings with President Ronald Reagan. Between 1985 and 1988, the two leaders met 5 times, building a relationship based on mutual respect. Reagan, who had once called the Soviet Union an evil empire, found Gorbachev to be a partner who was willing to negotiate sincerely. Their most important achievement came in December 1987 with the signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF Treaty. For the first time in history, both superpowers agreed to eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons. More than 2,500 missiles were destroyed, and inspectors were allowed access to nuclear sites to verify compliance. It was a groundbreaking moment in the long struggle to control the nuclear threat. But while Gorbachev's reforms eased tensions with the West, they began to unravel the foundations of the Soviet system itself. In December 1988, he announced at the United Nations that the Soviet Union would reduce its armed forces in Eastern Europe by 500,000 men. This declaration signaled the end of the Brezhnev Doctrine, which had guaranteed Soviet military intervention to protect communist regimes. With that threat gone, reform movements spread rapidly across the Eastern Bloc. By 1989, a wave of democratic revolutions swept through Eastern Europe. One by one, communist governments collapsed in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria. In East Germany, mass protests forced the government to open the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989. Crowds surged through the checkpoints, tearing down the wall piece by piece. The most powerful symbol of the Cold War had fallen, and Germany was on its way to reunification. The collapse of the Eastern Bloc accelerated the disintegration of the Soviet Union itself. Nationalist movements gained strength across the republics, and Moscow could no longer hold them together. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved into 15 independent states, ending more than 70 years of communist rule. The Cold War, which had dominated international relations for more than 4 decades, ended with surprising speed and without a major war between the superpowers.